All right. Good morning, everybody. How are you all doing? Good. I'm doing good. Thank you all for joining me. It's a really nice group. And I understand there's some folks online, so I'll wave to you through the camera. And for folks that might be watching this later, um, thank you so much for sharing some of your time with me today. Uh, wow, it's a lot to kind of cram in because I feel like if I just dive into our work, you all need some context first. So I want to give you a little bit of context of Guatemala, kind of brief history, just so that everything else that I talk about with our work, there's kind of a foundation there. So Guatemala is in Central America, just below Mexico and neighboring also Belize and above Honduras and El Salvador. A population of about 17 million people. It is the largest country in Central America. Guatemala City, which is where our work is primarily focused around, is the largest city in Central America. And the economy is very much still agricultural, with bananas, coffee, sugar, palm oil being the main exports. And in the city, probably one of the biggest industries is call centers. So a lot of times when you call customer service, there's a good chance you're speaking with a very fluent English-speaking Guatemalan, and that's been a booming industry in the city. The country has struggled a lot with poverty. Over half the population meets the definition of being impoverished, with a lot living in extreme poverty. Malnutrition is a really big problem for children in the country. And the country, and if we look at all of Latin America, is one of the has one of the greatest struggles with inequality between the wealthy and the poor. And so a lot of times, even with agriculture being such a big industry, there might be one family that owns it, but then is employing 1,000 workers who are all living in poverty. And so it's interesting because if you look at kind of the economy compared to others, it looks overall like it's doing better. But then when you look at it on a GDP per capita or looking at families, a lot are struggling, and it has some of the highest rates of malnutrition. So it's this interesting dynamic. Guatemala experienced a civil war from around the 50s, 60s through 1996, with some of the darkest years being during the 80s. You can Google this later. I won't go into too much detail, but involving the US and United Fruit Company. The US helped kind of uproot the government that was there before, and then a dictatorship ensued after that. There was a lot of widespread genocide that happened in the rural area, and a lot of people that were living in rural Guatemala migrated to the city, interestingly, to try and escape it. And so where did they go when they got to the city? They looked for different areas where they could set up squatter settlements, and a lot of them were around the Guatemala City landfill, which was land that had just been kind of filled over. It wasn't being used. And so the Guatemala City landfill, which is the biggest in Central America, has around 250,000 people living in all of the communities that kind of circumnavigate it, and they kind of look like this. And over time, that area has not only struggled with poverty, since many of the families are scavenging through the landfill for recyclables or anything they can generate a dollar out of, but it's also an area that has a lot of gang presence, narco trafficking, family brokenness, drug, alcohol abuse, and it's been challenging for the families there. You'll see homes that are made out of sheet metal shacks, and a lot of times in an area about as big as this up here with the pews, you've got anywhere from 5 to 10 people living in there. So it's an extremely challenging place. And I had the privilege, when I was serving in Guatemala with an organization called International Justice Mission, I was lucky enough to have a lot of Guatemalan friends who are involved in different ministries and work in these at-risk communities. And so I kind of got a glimpse at the issues and challenges they're facing from a local lens, from the context of Guatemalans. And it helped me understand more some of the challenges that they were going through, that it wasn't just poverty and they need education, but understanding the dynamics that's going on in the family, how that affects young children, their life trajectory, and then some of the other issues in the community that tend to make it difficult for families to be able to thrive. And when I say thrive, I'm not just talking about in economic sense, but in terms of their own personal happiness and well-being as well, which for me is even more important than just job attainment. So with that kind of said, we had this rural to urban migration that happened in light of the Civil War, and at the same time, kind of shifting gears a little bit, Guatemala back in the 60s, in terms of Latin America, was one of the countries that was the most progressive in terms of access to contraception and sexual and reproductive health rights. And then from that time period to now, it became one of the worst in the region. So Latin America as a whole is the region with the second highest rate of teen pregnancy. And within the region now, Guatemala is one of the countries, according to the UN Population Fund, that has the greatest need for sexual education and access to contraception. And in fact, if we go back to talking about malnourishment in children, USAID says that teen pregnancy is one of the highest kind of causes of child malnutrition in the country. So how does all of that kind of link into talking about at-risk communities in the city? Well, in our early years in the organization, when we initially started Guatemala Youth Initiative, our model was to partner with local NGOs or nonprofits that were working with youth at risk. And really what we wanted to do is come alongside them and give a boost to the work that they were doing. So if they're working in education or family counseling or child psychology or youth mentorship, we would help boost funds into them so they could have more staff. And then we would work alongside their leadership in program planning and monitoring and evaluation. And what we saw over time was that there were different kind of gaps in youth services, and they were seeing desertion. Kids were either dropping out of school or they're involved in the program heavily for 6 months and making a lot of progress and then would disappear. And so there's a lot of instability and really difficult for these NGOs that were trying to make an impact over the course of 10 years in their lives, with them coming in, dropping out, coming in. And so they're a huge support service, but in terms of sort of this life transformation that you would want to see in their personal well-being, it wasn't happening. And so one of the things that our organization did in 2017 was say, okay, why don't we do a study alongside youth at risk and their parents and their teachers, and try and uncover what are some of the root causes of the problems that they're facing, and where are their gaps in youth services. And during the focus group with the adolescents, I'll never forget how much they focused. I was expecting out of this, by the way, that they were gonna, peg, we need mentors and we need help with education. But if I bet money on that, I would have lost that bet. They focused completely on family brokenness and on the lack of connection with their parents, a feeling of rejection, neglect, and how that would drive them out onto the street. And when they would go out on the street looking for love and identity, they would find it in all the wrong ways, in the form of drugs and alcohol. In youth gangs, we found that roughly a quarter of adolescents were struggling with depression and drug abuse, and were basically self-medicating to cope with the problems that they had inside their home. And so despite the community-wide poverty and gang violence, those seem to sort of be secondary to the issues that were happening inside the home. So when I sat down with the teachers, I kind of asked them the question point blank. It sounds like, talking to youth, that a lot of the families, there's not the love that you would hope to see be there. How many of these families were because we're a married couple and we want to have children and raise a loving family, and the room just went uncomfortably silent until one of the teachers stood up and said, I don't think any of them were planned at all. They just come one after another, and the cycle just goes on. So we started looking at teen pregnancy rates in the community. And what we found was in the at-risk communities around the landfill, and we've done this study a couple times now since 2017, and it's always around the same number. Around 60% of adolescents become teen parents. It's a staggering rate. And one of the main issues is they have no access to contraception, despite the law granting them access. And they receive next to nothing in terms of comprehensive sexual education. And I'm not just talking about anatomy and understanding how the reproductive system works, but also things like healthy relationships, communication, consent. A lot of young women that don't even know they have the right to say no to their partner. And so all of these things are contributing to high rates of unplanned teen pregnancy. And then these same young pregnant women like Carol and Rosia, who's in the entrance, you can see her photo there, they're ostracized by society. A lot of times they're abandoned by their own families. They're scorned by their community. We've seen young pregnant women won't even leave their house for the duration of their pregnancy for fear of what their neighbors will say. And then on top of all of that, the big question that everybody asks is, in Spanish, is, ¿se va a hacer responsable el hombre? Basically, is the man going to take responsibility? And if the man's disappeared, you're deemed as less worthy in the community because he didn't stick by you. And so these young girls are going one through adolescence and all of the issues of a teenager, also in a community with very low income and lots of family problems at home, but also experiencing a pregnancy and then being rejected by everybody around them. We've even seen organizations that, even Christian organizations that have scholarship programs. And if one of the girls in their scholarship program gets pregnant, they get their scholarship yanked from them. And a lot of the school systems as well, they don't have a support mechanism to support young pregnant women. And in the study that we did, we found that 90% of pregnant teens, if they haven't graduated by the time they're pregnant, they drop out of school, 90% of them. And the 10% that didn't was because they had already graduated by the time of their pregnancy. And roughly around half or more don't have any support from the father of the baby. And so they're going through this challenge and this issue. And we also found that most of the other nonprofit organizations are focused on primary education and then mentorship programs around the middle school age. There's not much enrollment in high school or work with older adolescents because they tend to drop out of all the programs. And then there seems to be this gross neglect of early childhood development from childbirth for the first 3 years of life. Some of you may know this, but when you're born, about 25% of your brain's developed. But between birth and age 3, 90% of your brain gets developed. And so during that time period, your life experiences, the way that your parents interact with you, different things that stimulate you, the kind of relationships that you're around, all affect the way that those neurological connections are made. And so a child that goes through a healthy experience during those years tends to have very healthy development in the front temporal lobes, which is what helps us do logical thinking, critical thinking, thinking about decisions that will be good for us and our well-being in the future. But children that suffer trauma, it tends to be grossly amplified, the part of the brain that's in this survival mode of fight, flight, or freeze. And so they're constantly in that state of mind. And so if later in life you try and talk to an adolescent about, studying to go to college, the brain's not going to fire thinking about that. They're figuring out how to get through today. And so we saw several issues through this study that one, there's no support for adolescent mothers or early childhood development. And two, it's just going to go on forever unless somebody intervenes with comprehensive sexual education and access to contraception. And so we made this big shift in our model in 2018, where as before we were working alongside other NGOs, we decided to implement these programs directly. And one of the things that made us so successful was that history of before of partnering with other organizations. So when we opened up programs for comprehensive sexual education and contraception and support for adolescent mothers, it took off right away because all of the other organizations had recognized it as a huge need, but they didn't know how to address it. And so those are our 3 focus areas. And I actually want to do a quick exercise. Does anybody have a calculator on their phone? Yeah? Okay, I'm going to have you run a couple computations really quick. Can you let me know when it's up? Okay, put in 250,000. Okay, so that's roughly the population size surrounding the landfill. Now we're going to multiply that by the percent of population in Guatemala that's adolescents, so age around 14 through 19, and that rate is 18%. So multiply it by 0.18, 45,000. So there are roughly 45,000 adolescents around the Guatemala City landfill right now, and then multiply that by 60%, 0.6.
Why?
27,000. So 60% is roughly our estimate of how many adolescents will become teen parents. So 27,000 is kind of the rough projection. At some point in the next 5 years, there's going to be that many adolescent mothers that are really within like I guess you would say a 4-mile radius of the landfill. A staggering number.
No.
And so the cycle's just going to go on and on if nobody intervenes. And so our organization is really set up to try and stop this through prevention and through support.
15,000.
Right now, we have a free clinic for contraception. We're able to attend patients from age 14 and up. Guatemalan law does not require them to have parental consent. And so if they were to try and go to another place, most likely they'd experience a number of roadblocks to be able to access contraception. Through our partnership that we have for the contraceptive clinic, they're able to come in, be attended right away, leave. It's very private. We have differentiated attention for adolescents, which basically means we make sure that they understand completely about their anatomy, their body, how contraception works, and so that they're able to make an informed decision. We provide comprehensive sexual education. So our team of educators is partnered with over 20 schools, primarily middle schools and high schools, that are all around the Guatemala City landfill. Our goal is to provide comprehensive sexual education in every single one of them. And this year we've started to expand even down to, in Guatemala, the last primary school grades are 5th and 6th grade. So our goal is that we want somebody from 5th grade through high school to see us every year learning about sexual and reproductive health. We also have a youth leadership program. So recognizing that in Guatemala, only 50% of youth who are middle school age are actually in middle school. So after primary school, 50% drops out of school. And then when you talk about high school years, only 20% is enrolled. So even though we can get into every single one of the schools, we're still missing the majority of the youth that are there. So how do we reach them? We implement what's called a peer-to-peer sex education program. So we'll recruit promising youth in the community that have a strong interest in sexual and reproductive health rights, or gender equality, or who are standout leaders in their schools. And they go through an intensive training period with us. And so they learn about everything. So not just anatomy and contraception, but about consent, about how to be supportive of somebody who's LGBTQ, about how to identify risk behavior amongst their peers. And so we get a lot of referrals to our clinic from the adolescent population from them. Right now, we have about 45 active youth leaders, and those 45 youth leaders reach somewhere between 700 to 1,000 adolescents in the community every year. The contraceptive services that we provide, I think we just broke this number a couple months ago. They prevent over an estimated 1,000 pregnancies a year through the services. That's one nurse. And then in the program for Adolescent Mothers, which my wife runs, and she'll be here in a little bit with our two little ones, we launched that program a couple years ago, and it's been taking more and more form every year. But surprisingly, during the pandemic, it doubled in size. We work with around 100 young mothers, and predominantly ages 14 to 24. And so we do maternal education all the way from pregnancy through the first 2 years of life with the children. So typically every so often we'll go out into the community, but just to give you an idea of the prevalence of teen pregnancy. Our team can walk out by foot, and within an hour and a half of going around the community from our youth center, identify around 12 to 15 pregnant teens. And so we'll go out, connect with these teens, with their families as much as we can, and invite them to a training period where they come into our youth center and learn about breastfeeding, about nutrition, about health, about childcare, preparation for the birth, postpartum care, then about family planning and contraception. And so some of the highlights that we've seen from that has been drastic changes in nutrition. There's a lot of myths in the community. I was sharing some of the stories with Robin and her family the other night, but to give you an example, one of the moms young mothers that we worked with, everybody around her told her, don't eat this because it's going to make your milk dry up, or don't do this because it's going to cause this health issue for the baby. And so she basically had excluded everything from her diet except for tortillas and sausage weenies. And when we saw her after 2 months, she was completely malnourished. The baby was not doing well at all. And so nutrition is a big focus point for us on educating them about how to maximize their money to have a more nutrient dense diet that's going to be both beneficial for them and for the baby through breastfeeding. We also focus on the emotional changes that they go through in parenting, about healthy parenting habits. We have a local nutritionist and pediatrician that provide pro bono workshops for the moms, which has been huge during the pandemic because we do it all online and usually have about 40 adolescent moms connect every session. And we provide early childhood development for free for their children, but it's not set up as a center where the moms just come and drop off their kids and leave. They're structured as 45 minutes to an hour-long classes where the moms or a parent or family member come and participates alongside the child. So going back to early childhood development, it's not just what happens when they're at school or when they're at preschool or daycare, but a lot of times what happens back when they're at home. And so by having the family participate in that, we're hoping to also encourage reinforcement back at the house, which we found is one of the biggest issues that other organizations faced, is that their students would come in on Monday, broken and beat up from their experiences over the weekend, not having done any homework or studying, and then they would get better until Friday, and then just fall back down again by Monday. And so by having the parents involved, we're hoping to have them take a more active role in the children's lives. And we've seen 90% of the young mothers opt to use contraception. Virtually all of them are breastfeeding. And we also measure the progress of the children in early childhood development. Have seen huge jumps in their progress. So for ages 0 to 2, we have early childhood stimulation, which is focused on motor and sensory skills for the children. And then when they get closer to age 2, we start focusing more on cognitive development. And for the 2-year-olds, use sort of a Montessori-like learn through play methodology in a class structure where the moms are there alongside their kids. So they're learning everything that our teacher's doing so they can then go replicate that back at home as well. So in a nutshell, that's all of our work and everything that we're doing. I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but I want to.
Yeah, I think now we questions.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay. Yeah, yeah. That's a very good question. So Guatemala in, between Mexico and the rest of Central America, Guatemala has the largest number of indigenous languages, with Cachical being one of the predominant ones. Uh, Near the landfill for our work and virtually all the families that we've worked with, Spanish is the predominant language. So most times when the families moved, or maybe been a couple generations in the landfill, they've adopted Spanish, but they'll also have their own local dialect as well. That's not to say that there aren't children or families that speak one of the other indigenous languages. I think there's over 20 or 30 indigenous languages. So there's a huge variety. But for us in this city, it's predominantly all in Spanish. Mhm. That's a really good question. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So I'll go from most effective long acting to short acting. IUDs, subdermal implants that last. So the IUDs last 10 years, the ones that we use. Subdermal implants last 5 years. And then we have Depo, which is a 3-month injection, 1-month injection, daily pills, and we usually give them several months supply or free access to condoms. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Another very good question. And actually, interestingly, in the 90s, the Catholic Church pushed the Guatemalan government to sort of back out of some of the accords that we've been making internationally in Cairo on development. And there's a section in there about contraception and family planning. So they kind of pushed back on it. And so Guatemala was very despite being sort of pro-contraception in the 60s. And then I think the Vatican came out with its opinion, and being a Catholic country, it completely went against it. And so that's how it went from being progressive to behind. And then in the early 2000s, there was a lot of changes in legislature, making it more accessible, and the government supporting rights and access to, but the practices had kind of been so set in place that despite having the right or the access to, it wasn't actually happening in practice. But in our work, we've never received opposition or pushback from anybody. Everything that we're doing is completely legal and supported by law and by the government. In our work, in terms of working with youth or in the community, the only thing that we've experienced is if there's, say, for example, a community center that happened to be controlled or owned or run by the Catholic Church, we wouldn't be able to do anything regarding contraception in that center. So that's the only thing that we've seen, is that when we've wanted to collaborate, or have help for something, there's no open door, but we've never gotten any kind of pushback on what we're doing or experienced any issues in actually implementing our programs. Uh-huh. Everybody's so friendly in Guatemala. I was lucky that in my first year in Guatemala as a volunteer, I had met a lot of locals, and really just felt a deep connection with the country, which is why I think when I finished my 1-year volunteer position, I started the nonprofit and went back. But the people are so warm and friendly, and there's this interesting dynamic because Guatemala has this very big hierarchy and sort of social classes, but at the same time, like, you can sit down with anybody in any social class and become, best friends in a minute, whether it's the person selling produce at the local store or your mechanic or whoever. Guatemalans are very bubbly and friendly and warm. And so I think that's one of the things that I love most about Guatemala is that it's very easy to feel part of a community, you know, and in your interactions with other people. And then secondary, I would say the natural beauty. It is by far one of the most beautiful countries I've ever visited. Guatemala City is around Denver altitude, but because you're in Central America, it's just like constantly in the mid 70s all year round. It's absolutely amazing. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I wish I had the rest of my team here to give their thoughts on it too, because I'm sure you would get some different perspectives. But I'm going to share a quick story. Actually, I was thinking about sharing the story at the end, but I think it fits in really well with your question about stigma. There's a young girl named Flor who is 14 years old, pregnant, and very kind of selfly ashamed or embarrassed about her pregnancy, didn't want to leave the house at all. And so our team every once in a while will go through this sort of recruiting process when we want to get more young pregnant girls into the program. And so we do that by going out in the community and putting up flyers and posters and banners and handing out pamphlets. And usually we'll go to either leverage our youth leaders or go to some of the community leaders to talk about the program and the work that we're doing. And they'll even take us personally to all of the homes that they know where there's a pregnant teen. And so we'll go talk to the family. And in the case of Flor, she, you know, didn't want to be involved in anything, but after her mom learned about the program and the workshops that we were going to do, took her by the hand basically for the first day. And though she was kind of quiet in those first few days, she was taking copious amounts of notes every single day. And we just kind of saw this young person blossom over the course of, you know, the process being there around 15 other adolescent mothers and realizing, wow, I'm not the only one. Like all of these other young women are going through the exact same thing. And so then they start talking about their pregnancy symptoms and what they're going through, and it starts opening them up. And Jess, my wife, who's coming in with our two little ones there, is the one that works with our pregnant teens through that workshop series. And so a big part of it is trying to discontinue this thing of the pregnancy being something negative and bad that happened, because that's really not the kind of, you know, environment that we want to have with a new life coming into play, especially with all of the risk factors in the community. And so it's one of the things that I think the first time that they feel like they're being celebrated as mothers and their children. And so that starts removing some of that stigma that they feel out in the community or at home. They really find, you know, a sense of community and friendship at the organization and with the other moms. And as time goes on, you know, I think one of the things that we've identified is what a strong role they play in the community in terms of, you know, advocating for other youth so that they don't go through the same experience, or for other moms that are or other young women that are pregnant to be able to refer them to us so that they get help. And so one of the things that we've seen is that Adolescent Mothers is one of our strongest groups of referrals of adolescents for contraception, and also one of our strongest referral groups for the Teen Mom program itself. So we'll have moms that maybe have 6-month babies or 12-month babies that have been with us for a while. And then we go through another recruiting phase and they'll, you know, refer a whole bunch of adolescent moms to us. And so it's one of those things with just time, patience, and a loving heart. All of that stigma gets removed. And then if you kind of work with them as teammates later on as well, and play up their role of making a difference in the community, that's where we've seen, a huge change from being this vulnerable, marginalized, adolescent to somebody that's shaping and making big improvements in their community. And so with Flor, just to finish that story, she has come to every single one of our classes and workshops that we offer, and has referred countless numbers of other moms, and then even personally came in and accompanied her younger sister who became sexually active and wanted to help her avoid an unplanned pregnancy. And so, young women like Flor, I think for me is the example of breaking down that stigma, supporting them, and then also seeing them become people shaping their community in a positive way.
I just wanted to know that I was really inspired by certainly that your organization has, but also the way in which you were so responsive to the needs of the community. The way you and your team have really just been so connected, listening, really trying to understand what's going on in to fit into that. To me, is a process of discernment that we all go through. Is how to. So honored to have you here today.
Thank you.
And Jess and Emma watching this online. Guatemala Youth Initiative. Shout to us. We'd love to pass. There's an email list. Flyers about the work there. You can it's really easy to get that to them. Again, thank you so much. Greg.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you so much.